to find the graphics.
Because yeah, the presentation I did yesterday, I saw you had a 1 minute countdown video.
Yeah, so we have 2 minutes to go. So 1 minute countdown. Then I want to introduce you. So yeah, we'll be just. I will wait another 30 seconds that people who are coming. Well, okay, there was a break, so there's no problem. I think I'm gonna wait just 30 seconds and then launch the 1 minute countdown.
Sounds good.
Good afternoon, good morning for some people, and welcome to this session of LRVS. My name is Jo Ameyer, working for Fluidtech. I'm very pleased to be moderator for this session, this interesting session we have. I'm also extremely honored and feel very honored and pleased to introduce to Evan Zabawski. For those who doesn't know Evan is working as a senior technical advisor at TestOil, and I must really say, Evan, every STLE magazine, TLT magazine who comes out, I'm looking forward to your contribution and the notes, because the way you can write realistic things of surrounding us in industry, you can describe it so simple, but also very interesting. So I just wanted to say that to you, and I'm sure he's going to do it in the same way. This presentation entitled Variability in Oil Analysis Results. Evan, good luck for the participants. The code of this presentation is 3MFJ, and so now I'm gonna just leave the floor entirely to.
Great. Thanks, Jo. So yes, I know some people have heard the quote before. If you can't explain it simply, then you don't understand it. So I've always tried to hold on to that you should be able to explain something simply. So this presentation is called Variability in Oil Analysis Results, or as I like to call it, how much of a difference or how much of a change before I should worry. It's probably one of the most common questions I get regarding oil analysis results directly, is that people are always trying to interpret them, and they're wondering, well, if the result goes up or down by X amount, is that enough of a change to be concerned? Is that enough of a change to alarm it, to do something different? Or is it just, par for the course, or as we would say in the lab here, error within the method, noise on the instrument? So that is the goal of this presentation, is to give you a little bit of an insight as to how much change is enough before you should worry. So as Jo said, I am the Senior Technical Advisor at TestOil, and in my role, I'm largely responsible for training. So stuff like this is mostly what I get to do, try and share my knowledge and impart a little bit of wisdom. So for today's presentation, I thought the best way to try and share some knowledge would be to share an oil analysis report. So here's a report. And for those of you who are not familiar with the overall format layout of a report, because they do vary from some labs to others, let me point out a couple things about this report as we go through it, just because I'm only going to really dwell on a couple pieces of data. But first and foremost, when you look at an oil analysis report, essentially there will be a column, as we have on this report. Sometimes it's a row, just kind of depends on the orientation of the report. But there's a baseline set of information. This is what virgin oil will look like. It's usually results from a sample sent in by the end user, and that is your new oil column or your new oil line or baseline or whatever you might want to call it. Some people call it reference, whatever that might be. Next to that, you always have what we would call the current sample. So that's what I'll be referring to it as. So it's just the most recent sample on an oil analysis report. So when I use that term, that's the column I'm referring to for any of the data. And just to give you a little bit more, I'll refer to, the very furthest right samples, the first sample followed by the second, the third, the fourth, that kind of numbering. So when we look at results, if I refer to a particular sample, then you know which column I'm referring to. But like I said, we're not really going to go through the whole report in great detail. I just want to go over a couple of key things just to identify some examples of variability. Now, with this report, one thing I'll preface the entire discussion about is that this particular report, I have removed all of the alarms. Okay, so there's no result highlighted by any means, because I didn't want us to focus on whether or not it's alarmed. I wanted us to simply focus on, should I be concerned? So for the sake of this discussion, since we only have 20 minutes or so together, I'm going to confine it to just a couple different results. So let's take a look at this report and just zoom in on a couple of results. So first and foremost is iron. Iron is the first set of results on this report, and if you look at the data, you might question as to whether or not that is enough of a change to be concerned. Or what some people might look at is when they see the result going from the third sample to the fourth sample, they see that the results are going down. And then by the time they look at the most current sample, they see the result has come back up. And this always causes people some concern, because they would say, how come wear metals go down? Right? If I haven't changed the oil, how do wear metals go down? And this is why you have to understand variability, because in effect, they didn't go down. But we need to understand that a bit more clearly. So I'll use the iron example as one of our examples. Another one I'll quickly point out, is right below that, is the copper results. Now, if you look at the copper results, they're a lot steadier. But again, people might wonder, is this still enough of a change from one result to the other to be concerned? What I'll also focus on, if I scroll down on this report here, if I look at the bottom half of this report, I will see some data relating to particle count. Now, if you look at the fourth sample compared to the most current sample, that is a 10-fold increase in particle count. Now, that usually doesn't take much of a leap in logic here to understand that's probably a cause for concern. But what I'm going to focus on is actually over here, where we look at the results from the second to the third sample, and we see about a 30% jump in the results. And again, we're going to ask that question, is this enough change to be worried about? So this is the example I will use as we go through this discussion. And I'm going to come back to these pages just so you have them as a reference. But what I'd like to discuss now is the actual, the meat of the presentation, the variability side. So for you to understand variability, I need to use some definitions, and these come right from ASTM. So ASTM, when they define the precision and bias of any particular method, they use two terms. One is called repeatability. The other one's called reproducibility. So let me define repeatability first, because it's nice and easy, and then I'm going to discuss reproducibility at length. So repeatability is quite simple to understand. Basically, you're going to use the same test method on the same sample, but in essence, what you're doing is you're testing that sample on the same piece of equipment with the same operator on the same day. Everything's the same. So essentially, this is like taking a sample and testing it 2 times, in a row on the exact same piece of equipment. So we call this kind of, comparison the as close as possible result. So this is, basically best case scenario, how close could 2 results ever be to each other? Now, where things get a little bit different, and you're gonna have to, bear with me on this explanation here, is how reproducibility is defined. Now, reproducibility is a little bit the same and a little bit different. Now, what is the same is we're going to be using the same test method on the same sample, but what differs is the basic logic would be, from ASTM, at least their perspective, is that you're going to take that sample, split it into 2, and you're going to send one sample to one lab and another sample to a different lab. That's what reproducibility essentially is referencing, a split sample and comparing results from 2 different labs. So by their definition, everything else is different then. It goes to a different lab with a different operator on a different piece of equipment, and therefore there's going to be an expected amount of variance between these results. So we call this type of comparison the real world comparison. And this is the realistically, how much should you expect the results to differ? So that's the ASTM definition, but bear with me on this one because I'm going to twist the definition a little bit just so you can understand how this can apply to interpreting oil analysis. So imagine, if you will, that we have a machine that's running, it's got lubricant in it, and 1 month ago, we pulled a sample from it and sent it off to be tested, of course. But immediately after it was sampled, we shut that piece of equipment down. Okay, so a month goes by, here we are, it's today. Today, we decide to return that piece of equipment into operation. So we fire it up, turn it back on, whatever it is, and as soon as it gets back up to temperature, so I'm talking like within half an hour, we take another sample and we send that sample off to be analyzed. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. If you imagine those 2 samples that are a month apart, but the machine did not run, what I'm hoping that you can appreciate, and I understand, if we get into a lot of detail on this, you might disagree, but I'm hoping you'll just generally agree with this statement. Because the machine did not run, those 2 samples, even though they're a month apart, are actually the exact same sample. That they're close enough to be the same to call them the same. With 0 amount of runtime on the oil has not changed appreciably. Now, again, I understand some people might say, well, it could have gotten contaminated or could have degraded, or I'm just saying, work with me on this one. The machine didn't run, therefore you shouldn't accumulate things like wear metals. You shouldn't really accumulate a whole lot of degradation or anything else in there. So my logic is those 2 samples are the same. Now, if you can agree with that statement, but imagine the scenario of a sample taken a month ago versus a sample taken today, well, there's a next to nil chance that those 2 samples, even if you sent them to the same lab, were actually tested by the same operator on the same piece of equipment. So what I'm hoping you're getting out of this, rough analogy I'm giving you here is that if we look at repeatability as a comparison for 2 results from the same piece of equipment, that's too optimistic. But if we use reproducibility, it actually is fairly close. It's not the true definition of reproducibility, but if you can imagine a sample taken a month ago, machine shut down, sample taken today, machine turned back on, those are arguably the same sample, but like I said, everything else could be different. So reproducibility is kind of my baseline, if you will, for how much change I would ever expect between any 2 samples, because realistically speaking, the sample taken a month ago compared to a sample taken today would have 1 month of runtime on them, and therefore would be slightly different. So long story short, what I'm saying is, if you look at reproducibility values, that is the minimum amount of change you should expect between any 2 results before thinking that the sample actually has undergone some kind of change, that there's been an increase in wear metals or increase in contamination or degradation byproducts or whatever it is you're measuring. So I'm hoping that you understand and that you see that. Understandably, though, like I said, that's not the actual definition of reproducibility, but it's just a way of understanding what can we do with the precision and bias statements provided to us by ASTM. Now, saying all that, the one last thing I'll mention about these reproducibility type statements is that ASTM always defines them as 19 times out of 20 or with a 95% confidence rate, meaning that 95% of the samples that are analyzed should fall within these values stipulated by ASTM for a lab to be qualified as performing the test as per an ASTM standard. I'll tell you this, a commercial lab cannot run if 5% of its data is questionable, if 5% of its data fell outside of these limits. So most commercial labs are actually much better than 95% confidence, simply because 5% of the daily analysis being outside of those limits, being beyond the expected, would be very problematic for its customers. But that is just the definition from ASTM. So that's when you see as the examples I give you, you'll notice that kind of verbiage is being used 19 times out of 20, because it's just simply me quoting directly from the ASTM method. So saying all that, let's return to our previous example. I gave you a wear metals example of iron. Now that iron result was hovering around 100 ppm. So let's look at the ASTM precision and bias statement for elemental spectroscopy for iron at 100 ppm. Now I'll turn on my laser pointer here so you know exactly where I'm looking. I always hate this because some presenters say bob it around too much gets distracting. So I'll try and keep mine as still as possible. So I'm going to the repeatability table. I'm finding iron. So iron is here. And I'm going over till I see 100 ppm as a concentration. So just to the right of my laser pointer there is the repeatability for elemental spectroscopy measuring iron at a concentration of 100 ppm. The short answer is ASTM allows a maximum 5 ppm variance. Now that's not plus or minus 5 ppm. That's an absolute difference between any two results. They cannot vary by more than 5 ppm. What that means is if I test the sample and it comes out at 100 ppm and I retest it immediately, like within minutes, and test it a second time, the second result has to be within 5 ppm of the original result to qualify as being within the repeatability of ASTM D5185, which is the method we use for elemental spectroscopy. So that's your best case answer, how close two results could ever be to each other. But like I said, that's not the part we're really interested in. Let's look at reproducibility. So I'm going to come over to this chart here. Again, find iron. Again, find 100. And you'll see it right there. What that tells me is that the reproducibility for iron at 100 ppm is 21 ppm total variance. So what that means is if I test a sample at 100 ppm and test it again at a different lab, I could get a result anywhere from 100 as long as it was within 21 ppm. So it could be as high as 120 is my point, and that would be considered the same result. So that's the important takeaway here, is realizing that that's quite a big jump, right? That's a 20% difference. And if you look around this chart and look at some of the other numbers that are on here, what you'll notice is that every element has its own precision and bias variance. And some elements are more precise at low numbers. Some elements are more precise at higher concentrations. Every element is different though. So what I can't tell you is that something like, I couldn't make a statement saying elemental spectroscopy is accurate to within 10%, because truth be told, some elements are far more accurate than 10%, but at some concentrations, some elements are far worse than 10%. So there's no blanket statement for elemental spectroscopy. It varies according to the element, it varies according to the concentration. But in our example that I showed you earlier, iron is allowed 21 ppm variance. Now the other value I showed you quickly was copper. So if we go to copper, and copper was around 20, you'll see right here, just to the left of my laser pointer, that it allows about again, 20% variance on that number, 2.4 ppm on a 10 ppm concentration. So armed with that in mind, if we go back to the report, so I can move away from my laser pointer here. If we go back to the report and look at the actual iron results, when you look at the iron results, that third sample is 96, but the next sample is 87. And you go, how did it go down? It didn't go down. It's within roughly, again, 96 is very close to 100 ppm. So it's within that 21 ppm allowable variance. It's the same result. Now, the fact that it jumped back up to 103, again, that's within the allowable variance. Essentially, what I'm saying to you is those three results are the same result, that in fact, iron has not changed. And this is, again, like I said, a very common question I get, and one of those hardest things to understand about oil analysis results, because people always go, how come it went up, then it went down, then it went back up? And I try and explain to them, I said, it didn't do that. It's the same result the whole time. And they go, but no, but they look at the numbers and go, clearly it went up because, the second sample was 76. So if it went from 76 and jumped up to 96, that seems like an increase. But then to drop to 87 seems like a decrease, and, back up to 103 seems like an increase. And I go, ultimately, those results are within what I said before, the error of the method and the noise on the instrument. So when you look at those iron results, they are, pushing the limits, but they're all pretty much within that 21 ppm range. So they are essentially the same result. When you look down at the line below it to copper, and know again that we're allowing, on 10 ppm, we're allowing 2.4 ppm variance. Now you really appreciate those results are in fact the same result the whole time. So our conclusion on this particular report, looking at the wear metal side of it, wear metals aren't changing. Wear metals are a very steady, flat trend. However, let's look at particle count for a second. So particle count, when you look at this one here, has some repeatability statements. And with repeatability, you can see the numbers here. But like I said, what we need to worry about more is reproducibility. That's the number set that we can actually reference when comparing results. So reproducibility for particle count is significantly higher than the repeatability. So take a look at these numbers here. You can see the greater than 4 micron particle count has 113% variance, meaning that the result can more than double. The 6 micron is a little bit less, but the 14 micron is even higher. So this is very interesting because it's, again, one of those very common questions I get is that, when you look at a particle count, should you worry about the count itself, or should you pay attention to the ISO codes? And if you understand ISO codes, you understand that every time the result increases by one ISO code, the result doubles. And people have often wondered, why do we take a set of results and simply code it into a new set of numbers? And as I always try and explain, really what it's trying to do is remove the resolution of the results. It's trying to simplify and group the results into broad categories. So ISO codes are basically broad categories. But again, some people point out that the result can almost double, not quite double, almost double, and still be within the same ISO code. And they go, isn't that concerning? Isn't that alarming? And once I point out these reproducibility values and show you that actually the error within the method, the noise on the instrument, is over 100%, what that really means, and this is why I put the statement here so you can see it, that means that for ISO codes, that could be up to a 2 ISO code change, and it's still technically the same result. So the results haven't really changed, even if they bump around by 1 or 2 ISO codes. So that is, again, just error within the method. And once you understand this, you can appreciate why, I know for me, when I discuss particle counts and I talk about a target or, maybe even discuss limits, I always say, give or take an ISO code, because I don't get, too sticky about being right to an exact ISO code, because I know the results, are allowed to vary by at least 1, and more than 1 is technically 2. So I can allow up to a 2 ISO code variance, and it's just error within the method. So again, if we go back to our example here and we look at that second and third sample, like I said, you'll notice a 30% difference between those results. But if you look at the ISO codes, what do they do? Right? They're within plus or minus 1 ISO code. So if you look at the first, the second, the third, and the fourth sample in this series here, what you're going to see is that they're all essentially the same result. As much as the actual particle counting has changed, because they're all within that give or take an ISO code, it's all the same result. It's only when you look at the current sample, which is significantly higher, like I said, about a 10-fold increase. So you can see it went up by, approximately 3 ISO codes. That is enough of a change to worry about. That is where we get concerned. But the previous 4 results are actually all the same result. So I know I've given you a couple examples here, iron at 100 ppm and particle counting in particular, showing you that oil analysis results can vary significantly. And this might cause some people some alarm because they might be thinking, geez, do I trust any result from this point forward? Because apparently, nothing's accurate. Well, to leave you with a little bit of an optimistic note, not all tests are this varied. Some tests are a little bit better. So the example I'd like to just, kind of conclude with is show you viscosity. So viscosity for repeatability is less than 1% change. Now that means second decimal place on a result. So that is a very, very accurate result. Less than 1% change allowed 19 times out of 20. But again, like I said, let's worry about reproducibility. So the reproducibility values for viscosity, they're a little bit higher, but they're still quite good. They're sitting there around 1.3% change. So again, we're still really ultimately talking about second decimal place on a viscosity result is the amount of variance that you should expect. And considering that most labs only report 1 decimal place for viscosity, because we just don't need that kind of resolution on a viscosity judgment, you don't have to worry about viscosity results. So just to give you examples of, like I said, how much variance each test has, well, the short answer is it varies, right? It depends on the test. But here's what I'm hoping that you get out of this. Always remember that there will be a precision and bias statement with every ASTM method that any oil analysis testing can follow. Sometimes there may be multiple. So as the example that I'm showing you here for viscosity, I've chosen the one for formulated oils because there's precision and bias statements for base oils. There's ones for additives. So I've chosen the combination because that being probably the most relevant to most people. But every test has its own set of parameters, and these certainly can be looked up. Labs are required to know them. If they're going to be ISO 17025 certified, they have to be within them. They have to be able to be audited to show they're within these limits. So some labs choose to publish these types of results, the reproducibility limits, just to show how good or bad the result can be expected to be. But here's my point. I think the key takeaway as I wrap up here, just know that every test does have its own precision and bias statement, and every test will provide it to you in probably slightly different formats. Some of them are based on percentages, some of them are goofy formulas, some of them have tables. I mean, it's presented in a number of ways. But the big thing is just know that the results from every test, it can vary. So sometimes it varies with the concentration or the result. So what I'm getting at here is sometimes the higher the result, the more variance is allowed. Sometimes it's the lower the result, the more variance is allowed. Some tests are very hard to hit at low concentrations, but it varies. Every test is a little bit different. And the other thing is that even with a single test that may have multiple results, like elemental spectroscopy or particle count, what you'll realize is that every result has its own unique set of reproducibility and repeatability values. So it kind of gets a bit messy if you try and keep track of all these. So here's my recommendation, the note that I'd like to end on, is that when I show examples like the reproducibility chart that I did from elemental spectroscopy, or those percentages I showed you for particle count and viscosity, I never expect people to refer back to those or keep those as handy references while they're doing oil analysis interpretation. You'll drive yourself crazy trying to keep track of all that. More what I get to is that you'll get a feel for how much variance is allowed if you simply trend your results. Because that's the most important way of interpreting your results, isn't to look at how much change there is from one result to the next, right? You don't just focus on the most current sample and the previous sample. You look at all the history you have coming before it and see how much change has there really been. And when you start to use trending as your tool, you'll realize that that smooths out a lot of that error within the method and noise on the instrument, and you don't have to worry about it so much. But, like I said, the big takeaway is expect some change is just error within the method, noise on the instrument, and not to overinterpret your results. And that's probably the most common fault I find people making when they read oil analysis reports, is that, a few ppm here or there on wear metals, or, a little bit of particle count change or viscosity change. And some people just, get all concerned. And really, at the end of the day, if you ask somebody who's experienced in this, they look at the same result and go, it's nothing to worry about. So usually, what I like to end on is the comment that, hey, practice makes perfect. The more of these reports you look at, the better at it you get. So, keep practicing. And if you have any questions, by all means, always contact your lab and see what they think too. So with that, I'll end here and turn it over. If there have been any questions, or if you do have any new ones, by all means, ask away. We've got a couple minutes left, but thank you all for attending the presentation. I hope you got something out.
Thank you so much, Evan. It was again, like Danny was telling in his comments, explained just very beautifully, clearly. I could not agree more with you about making conclusions on trending. The more data you have, the more trends you can establish, and that's usually the big battle we have with end users, trying to convince them to also generate enough data in function also of criticality. But I must say that from the last this whole pandemic, one thing we have experienced is that a lot of customers have realized that their own analysis data, that's what they rely on, and they've been sending out more reports or samples for analysis. So we have a good question from Danny, which I will show up. And I know you know how you're going to handle that, how you're going to answer that. You can see the question. So should we
Yep.
use reproducibility variations even though the tests are run in the same lab? So please go ahead.
Yeah. So short answer is it would depend on the lab if they had more than one piece of equipment. As an example, at our lab, we have up to a half a dozen different pieces of equipment to run the same test. So it's not fair to use reproducibility repeatability because repeatability is meant to be the same sample on the same piece of equipment, the same operator. So even though we might run the same sample twice, if we run it on two different instruments or have two different operators doing it, then arguably that fits more like reproducibility. So if you deal with a very small lab who only has one piece of equipment for each test, then no, you should use repeatability. If they have multiples, like I said, most larger scale commercial labs, reproducibility is the fairer comparison. And I know that leads right into this next question that comes after the one that's on screen. So I'll answer that in a second. But the on-screen question here, ideal frequencies. My short answer, my go-to answer is yes. Oil analysis should be quarterly unless dictated otherwise. If you look up ASTM D6224 recommended test frequency, there's a table in there. Top row of the table recommends a frequency, and pretty much quarterly is recommended for most types of machines, most types of oils, and most testing. Some you do a little bit less frequently. So the question is, varnish analysis every half year or yearly. The big, I guess, to me, determinant as to whether or not you are going to go less frequently than quarterly is the volume of the system. If you have a particularly large volume system, you can get away with doing things less often because basically the large volume dilutes the results and they're going to change more slowly. But what I would say is that probably you want to, if you're tracking something like varnish, you probably want to do some minimal varnish testing every quarter, just like the rest of your results. And you save maybe the bigger, more expensive testing for the half year or annual type testing. So things like MPC, the membrane patch colorimetry, you could do every quarter. But if you're doing things like RPVOT as part of your overall varnish look, yeah, you might want to save that one to a bit less frequently. But anyways, like I said, I know the previous question tracked into this question here. And it says, what will the variation be in results when testing of the oils conducted in online and offline? That is exactly the definition of reproducibility. Just two different sets of instruments, two different operators. So as long as we're talking about the same methodology, so like take particle counting as an example. The particle counting technology that goes into an online sensor and the particle counting technology that is used inside the lab is the same technology. So you can quote ASTM D7647 and their reproducibility results for those two different methods. Now, if you were comparing, as an example, the acid number, and in the lab, acid numbers done by a titration, but in a portable or online type format, it's done by infrared, then you can't use that same comparison. That's two different technologies. Therefore, there isn't a fair comparison. But as long as you know they're both done by the same overall method, then yeah, just use the reproducibility values. It doesn't matter if it's online, offline, both in a commercial lab, both on site, it doesn't matter.
Absolutely. So thank you, Evan. It was clear, very clear. You received some wonderful evaluations already. So what a great class. Greg is saying I could not agree more. So great session. Thank you so much for your contribution, Evan, and also to the LRVS. It will be of very high value. I wish everybody a good two final sessions. There's one session to go, and then a panel discussion on artificial intelligence. And for the rest, I thank everybody for its participation. So have a nice evening, a nice day, and see you at the next. Thank you again, Evan.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.